You don't own the land you live on. You don't control the infrastructure you depend on. You don't set the prices of housing, energy, healthcare, or credit. Yet every month you still owe rent, not to a lord in a castle, but to a system that decides access before opportunity. And that raises an uncomfortable question. At what point does an economy stop being modern and start behaving like feudalism again? Welcome to The History of Money, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. When people hear the word feudalism, they immediately picture armor, castles, kings, and peasants tied to the soil. It feels distant, primitive, obsolete, a system buried by progress and swept away by modernity. But feudalism wasn't really about swords or titles. It was about the control of productive assets. In medieval Europe, land was the source of everything: food, shelter, protection, and survival itself. If you controlled the land, you controlled life. Power was literally in your hands. But if you didn't, your options were unfortunately limited, no matter how hard you worked. Peasants weren't poor because they were lazy. They were constrained because they didn't own what mattered. Consequently, they entered into stable, predictable, and deeply unequal arrangements: labor in exchange for access, loyalty in exchange for protection, and rent in exchange for survival. This wasn't chaos, it was order. Feudalism worked precisely because it minimized uncertainty. Everyone knew their place. Mobility was rare. Ownership was concentrated, and stability mattered more than freedom. This is the part modern narratives leave out. Feudalism wasn't defeated because it was inefficient. It was disrupted because something else temporarily became much more powerful than land. That something was capital. Industrialization broke the monopoly. Land held over survival. Factories replaced fields, cities replaced manors, and wages replaced obligations. For the first time in history, people could earn income without owning the underlying asset. This was the great promise of the modern economy. You weren't dependent on land, but on skill. You didn't need inheritance. You needed labor. You didn't need permission. You needed a job. Ownership still mattered, but it had lost its old gravity. It wasn't everything anymore. For a while, access to income was enough. This window changed everything. The 19th and 20th centuries created something historically rare: a vast middle class with rising wages, expanding ownership, and genuine vertical mobility. Homes became attainable, savings mattered, and labor had leverage. Productivity gains translated, imperfectly but meaningfully, into better lives. This period taught people a powerful lesson, and they assumed it was permanent. However, it wasn't a new equilibrium. It was a historical exception. Because while land lost its dominance, the power of ownership never vanished. It simply shifted forms. Factories turned into corporations, property into financial instruments, and infrastructure into balance sheets. Gradually and quietly, ownership began to reconcentrate. Not through conquest, but through markets. No banners, no declarations, no villains, just incentives. By the late 20th century, the logic of the system changed again. Capital became mobile, assets appreciated faster than wages, and finance outpaced production. Gradually, access to the things that matter, housing, education, healthcare, energy, depended not on ownership but on continuous payment. We became dependent on debt servicing. Old obligations returned in new styles: not loyalty, but debt; not serfdom, but subscription; not land tenure, but permanent rent. The language softened, but the structure remained. If there were a gold medal for economic euphemism, modern systems would still be on the podium in the top three. because what replaced feudal obligation wasn't freedom, it was conditional access. You could live anywhere as long as you could pay. You could move freely as long as your credit allowed it. You could participate as long as you remained solvent. And unlike medieval peasants, modern participants were told this was empowerment. After all, making a choice feels like freedom, even when the options are nearly identical. As terrible as that situation is, that is the reality. This is where the comparison becomes uncomfortable. Feudalism wasn't defined by cruelty or torture. It was defined by dependency without ownership. And dependency doesn't require palaces. It only requires that the assets essential to life are owned by someone else. The medieval serf depended on land he didn't own. The modern worker depends on housing, infrastructure, platforms, and financial systems he doesn't own. Different tools, same logic. Just like feudalism, the system doesn't need to be malicious to be stable. It only needs to be accepted. Most people didn't rebel against feudalism because it was unjust. They endured it because alternatives were scarce. That is the part worth paying attention to. When people feel trapped today, it's rarely because of laws. It's because of prices. The balance of power has shifted. Access has become conditional again, not by decree but by design drift. Before we discuss whether this is fair, sustainable, or inevitable, we need to understand how it happened. This system didn't arrive overnight, and it didn't announce itself. It evolved quietly. As ownership concentrated, risk was transferred downward, and stability was prioritized over mobility. Once you see this pattern, the parallels become impossible to ignore. Feudalism didn't disappear. It just learned how to hide. When ownership began to reconcentrate, the system didn't announce a return to hierarchy. It didn't need to. Hierarchies emerge through prices, not declarations. This shift accelerated when finance stopped serving the real economy and began reorganizing it. As capital became more mobile, assets became more valuable than production. Housing was no longer just shelter, it was a store of value. Infrastructure wasn't just a public necessity, it was an investment vehicle. Education wasn't just preparation, it was a leverage point repaid over decades of debt. With each transformation, ownership moved further away from those who depended on it. This is where the system quietly completed its evolution. In a feudal economy, wealth came from controlling land. In a financialized economy, wealth comes from controlling assets that appreciate faster than labor. The principle is the same, only the instrument have changed. Those who own appreciating assets accumulate leverage automatically. Those who rely on wages fall behind, even when they do everything right. Productivity rises, but ownership captures the gains. Labor remains mobile, but life becomes expensive. The system doesn't need to punish effort. It only needs to reward ownership more, and it does. Debt fills the gap, not as a failure, but as a feature. When wages can't keep up with asset prices, credit becomes the bridge between income and survival. Mortgages replace land tenure. Student loans replace apprenticeships. Consumer credit replaces savings. Every obligation is framed as an opportunity. Every payment is sold as progress. But debt does something subtle. It locks future labor into past prices. A medieval peasant owed labor to the land he didn't own. A modern worker owes labor to obligations he has already signed. Different vocabulary, same gravity. This is why mobility feels harder now. It's not legally restricted, but economically constrained. You can change cities, change jobs, or reinvent yourself, but the cost of restarting rises every year. Miss a payment, and the system reminds you who controls access. Nothing says freedom like needing approval just to exist. At this point, some object. They say this comparison goes too far, that modern life is nothing like feudalism, that no one is forced to stay, and that opportunity still exists. And they are right. Technically, Feudalism 2.0 isn't about chains. It's about dependence. The medieval serf couldn't leave because survival depended on land. The modern participant can leave, but only by abandoning access to housing, credit, healthcare, and stability. That is not coercion, it is conditioning. The system works precisely because it doesn't feel oppressive. It feels normal. People don't revolt against rent increases, they adjust their budgets. They don't challenge asset inflation, they chase returns. They don't question ownership concentration, they blame themselves. This is the genius of modern hierarchy. It doesn't demand obedience, it incentivizes compliance. And when instability appears, when inflation rises, bubbles burst, or crises hit, the system responds exactly as it was trained to. It protects the assets first. Liquidity flows upward, losses are socialized. Stability is temporarily restored by reinforcing the very structures that created the imbalance. If there were a gold medal for systemic consistency, this would be the winning discipline, because every intervention teaches the same lesson. Ownership is protected, dependency is managed. This isn't a moral judgment, it's an observation. Once you see it, modern economic anxiety starts to make sense. People aren't anxious because they are irrational. They are anxious because leverage has shifted against them. They feel productive but precarious, employed but exposed, free but dependent. They sense intuitively that effort no longer guarantees security, that security increasingly requires ownership they cannot reach. That is not a cultural failure, it is a structural one. Feudalism didn't collapse because people recognized it as unjust. It collapsed when alternative systems redistributed ownership enough to make dependency unnecessary. And here is the uncomfortable implication. If ownership keeps concentrating, dependency doesn't need to be enforced. It returns automatically. Not through violence, but through balance sheets. So the question isn't whether this system is fair. Systems don't care about fairness. They respond to incentives. The real question is whether a society can remain stable when most people participate permanently, but own temporarily. When they carry the risk but not the upside. When they rent stability instead of building it. Because stability without mobility eventually becomes stagnation. And historically, stagnation is what systems fear most. This doesn't mean collapse is inevitable. It means awareness is necessary. Understanding Feudalism 2.0 isn't about despair. It's about clarity. It's about recognizing that modern freedom isn't binary. It exists on a spectrum shaped by ownership, leverage, and access. And the closer you are to ownership, the more resilient you become. Not because you're smarter, but because the system is built to protect you. That is the truth history keeps repeating. Power doesn't disappear, it reorganizes. Economic systems don't die, they evolve, carrying their old logic into new forms. Feudalism didn't end when the castles fell. It ended when ownership widened, and it returned when ownership narrowed again. Different century, same mechanism. If this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe. History of Money,